feel to it, doesn't it? I started thinking about the early Christians in the catacombs and candles, you know. So things have changed in 2,000 years. And today I'm going to talk about how, as I said, we were talking about last week, that inner voice that we listen to, and how that begins to give us a base from which to act in life and be in life. And in religion, of course, things get a little carried away, and we started having formal religion, and then the emperor got involved, and suddenly there was a council, and everything had to be nailed down. We came up with a creed. You know, we have two creeds, the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, and that's supposed to represent the wisdom that has been given to us and from which we live. But if you look at those creeds, they're more like doctrine, dogma, and they're very dry. They're not that life-giving. And so many of the lines in there are just like facts that really don't have any impact on us. And so we have then a history of creedal churches where, you know, some point in the service you have to recite the creed. It's like reciting the Pledge of Allegiance, you know, and you better get on board with it. You have to believe everything, and if you don't, then you're not one of us. But in reality, our creeds need to be something much simpler, something more heartfelt, coming from the heart, and something then that leads to action. Something very simple that leads us clearly to action. And so we really should have verbs in our creed. You know, we should be talking not about doctrine and philosophy, but more about love, about kindness, about forgiveness, about non-violence, about hope. Our creeds really should be all about those things, and that they inform then how we live and how we behave every day. Today, I guess, we don't so much maybe have creeds in the world as we have mission statements, and we have vision statements, and then from there we set our objectives and 5-year plans and all of that. But in a sense, it's a lot simpler than all of that stuff that organizations want to have. It's what's in our heart? What is the voice saying in our heart to us? And of course, you know, those creeds went along with a certain vision of God, a certain image of God. And we studied that last year, about how God became so static. And it's all about the Almighty God, the all-powerful God. And stagnation, really, it's about strength and it's about control. That really don't speak to anything about our lives and how we experience life, because we don't experience life like that. It's ever-changing and challenging, and it's in flux. And so last year we studied about the infinite God, which is that more stable, almighty, all-powerful God. But then we talked about the intimate God that we experience in one another, and that keeps changing. Every time we come together, there's a different group of us here. It's a particular moment that will never be repeated again. All of us in this formation will never be in this room exactly as we are now. And even if we were, we would be different internally the next time. So that's not exactly what creeds give us. They give us a very stagnant, stable, in-control vision of God. And mostly, creeds are all about the mind, aren't they? They're feeding the mind, just the mind, with thoughts and beliefs. They're not really involving the heart, and they're not involving the gut, where God speaks to us very clearly too. And in a sense, it's all spirit and no soul and very little body. It's all about that infinite, far-off God, not the intimate God of how we experience God in one another. And it's not about that inner voice, that knowing deep down in our gut where God resides and God speaks to us and gives us life. So in a sense, it's about the empire, you know? It's about institutions and government. But it's not about the domestic church. It's not about where you and I live our lives at home, in relationship, in family, and in community like this and out there. So what we end up with is the disembodied Christ once again. It's not a Christ that we can touch and be intimate with. It's this diluted down, far off sense of God. And so why is all of that important? Well, the West, when the churches divided in the 11th century, focused on one thing: the resurrection of Jesus, the death and resurrection of Jesus. And so that became the dominant theme then for churches. Whereas in the East, they were looking at a corporate uplifting of humanity in the resurrection. In the West, it was all about one person. His name was Jesus. And that's all that was important. And it was all about you believing in him. And if you just did that one thing, then somehow you got carried along in his coattails. And you got in. You got elected on his surplus. But the Eastern Church was very aware and very clear about the fact that in the resurrection, something was there for everybody. And there was an experience there for all of us. It wasn't just about one guy on a pedestal. It was about all of humanity being swept into something, an energy that was uplifting and ascending, and we were all being uplifted and ascended along with him. And we can tell that that's a very different energy, isn't it? Like if you're trying to live your life and every day you're trying to connect with this event that happened 2,000 years ago to some guy, that's very different than waking up in the morning and thinking, there is something going on, there's a process in my life that's happening now, and it's uplifting me, and it's evolving me, and it's changing me into this incredible being that I don't even really know or understand what that is all about. And I was thinking, I've said this before, that this is a morphic field. This is like stepping into an elevator that's going to take you somewhere. And if you look historically at how things happen, back in the late 50s, we never had anybody run a 4-minute mile. And then Roger Bannister came along and he ran a 4-minute mile. And then Reverend Joe thought he was going to be second, right? Because he was a runner. But that's exactly what happened. Other people thought, well, wait a sec. If he can do it, why can't I do it? And of course, other people very quickly started running 4-minute miles. And just 2 weeks ago, we had Kipchoge run an under 2-hour marathon by 20 seconds. And then the next day, the woman in England runs 20 minutes under the women's record. So it's like something's going on there. That isn't just by chance. And I'm sure, there's a marathon in Dublin today. Maybe they ran under 2 hours. I don't know. But it's possible because there's a new energy, there's a new template and a new paradigm that we can step into because this other person did it. So yes, in that sense, Jesus was really important because he embodied an energy and he anchored an energy that on this planet that then became available, a consciousness that we can do this too. We can run the under 4-minute mile and we can run the under 2-hour marathon. And we can be the living God on earth if we so choose. And so we're being offered a new paradigm every day that our lives can be viewed very differently than how we think about them. And the Christ consciousness, that consciousness, revolutionizes how we can live and how we practice our faith. Two very different paradigms. Richard Rohr says, truth is always for the sake of love and not an absolute end in itself, which too often becomes the worship of an ideology. And we know that in the world, people are dying because of ideologies. People are dying because of creeds. You don't believe my creed, so therefore I'm going to wipe you off the earth. That's not what creeds were for. Creeds were meant to bring us together. And if it's not about love and hope and peace and justice and forgiveness, then that's where it ends up. It becomes something that divides rather than something that brings us together. And so we have to engage those three centers of the mind, the heart, and the gut in our creeds, in how we heal, because that's really what creeds are all about. They're a plan for how we're going to heal our lives and how we are going to fulfill our potential, which again is what Rohr says the Christ is all about. The Christ is us living our full potential. And so we have a lot of healing to do to let go of the limited mindsets and the conditioning that we have been given through no faults of their own by our parents, by our families, and indeed by our governments. We have to be continually on the alert for how we are being sold a much smaller vision of ourselves. And we must step into that energy that is so powerful that just wants to lift us up and lift the world up. And so, in that sense, then we are being called into an expanded consciousness in our head. And we are being called to an expanded love in our heart. And we are being called to an expanded understanding of who we are in our gut. You know, if you go into the heart space, it's easy to have nice, warm, fuzzy feelings there. But that isn't quite what a spiritual master feels when he or she goes into the heart space. The spiritual master connects with this incredible energy of love and extends it out to the world, extends it out to everybody that they meet. You know, we're so often satisfied with just having some nice, warm, fuzzy feelings towards a few people. But we're being asked to go way beyond that, but we're being asked, first of all, to connect to the power of that energy that is divine, that is so expansive, that we can literally be here this morning and touch the lives of people on the other side of the world, because that's what we're intending. And we're connecting with that river of love, and we're sending it out to activate those people that we don't even know on the other side of the globe, so that they too will come into an awakened consciousness. So in that sense, Jesus set the bar very high for all of us. He showed us what we're capable of once we are in touch with that divine energy. Cousin Stockus says, Christianity only embraces the soul, not the whole human experience. And that has been the case certainly for many centuries, but I think we're beginning to change that. I love what Matt Gahn says about love what arises. You know, that's not just about, you know, spirit and all things warm and fuzzy. Loving what arises is about really appreciating your experience for what it is, and for being willing to jump into it and to observe it first of all, but also then to connect with it so deeply that you love the experience. And again, in the creedal churches, many of them have communion, or the Eucharist. And so when you go to communion, you take the wafer, or you drink the wine, or grape juice. It was really meant to be a full transference of identity. That you were identifying with the divine, that you were taking it in, and that it was within you, and that was living in you, and that this was going to transform you. It's going to be that kind of a nourishing spiritual meal, that you would be a different person after eating or partaking in the communion. There's that tendency in humanity, unfortunately, that when we think of spirituality, we think of out there, up there, and we think of going upwards, striving. And yet the great irony is that what Christianity has said to us is that God is down here. And all the time we're trying to get out of the mud. We're trying to climb up the ladder and not be in the mud, because we don't like it. And yet God, the Spirit, is in the clay, in the mud. That's what the whole book of Genesis starts off with, of how God is totally embedded in all of this. And we're attempting to climb out of and to escape from, to get away from the messy human experience. And we think of holiness, or we think of spirituality, as when we finally break the chains and get away from that. And that's not at all what we're being asked to do. God is forever overcoming that imaginary gap that we have in our minds between humanity and the divine. And God is continually inviting us and asking us to bridge that gap, to shorten that gap. We're being asked to embrace our full humanity with its weaknesses, its faults, its failings, its flaws, its wounds, and integrating them into a life that is also divine. Not running away from that, not thinking that that's bad. It's just all part of the process. It's part of how we grow and evolve. And so we are invited, just like Jesus showed us, to follow the path of humility, to descend into whatever we consider to be messy, too messy, that we want to get away from. We're asked to embrace that. In the book, on page 111, which I thought was interesting, all the ones, he has a piece that he calls the Divine Map. And there are a couple of statements in this page that just blew me away. Jesus walked, enjoyed, and suffered the entire human journey, and he told us that we could and should do the same. His life exemplified the unfolding mystery in all of its stages, from a hidden divine conception to a regular adult life full of love and problems, punctuated by a few moments of transfiguration and enlightenment, and all leading to glorious ascension and final return. As Hebrews says, "For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weakness, but we have one who was like us in every way, experienced every temptation, and never backtracked." We do not need to be afraid of the depths and the breadth of our own lives, of what this world offers us or asks of us. We are given permission to become intimate with our own experiences, learn from them, and allow ourselves to descend to the depth of things, even our mistakes, before we try too quickly to transcend it all in the name of some idealized purity or superiority or morality. God hides in the depths. It is not seen as long as we stay on the surface of things, even into the depths of our sins. Remember the archetypal encounter between the doubting Thomas and the risen Jesus? It's not really a story about believing in the fact of the resurrection, but a story about believing that someone could be wounded and also resurrected at the same time. Someone could be wounded and resurrected at the same time. This is a quite different message and still desperately needed. Put your finger here, Jesus said to Thomas, and like Thomas, we are indeed wounded and resurrected at the same time, all of us. In fact, this might be the primary pastoral message of the whole gospel. There's not a sequence here that we're wounded first and then we're resurrected. There's a contemporaneous experience of woundedness and of resurrection. And so often, just because we're feeling the woundedness, we discount the resurrection. We think, well, I mustn't be getting it. I'm still the same old 5/8. I've not made any progress. I thought I was past this thing. Why is it showing up again? Well, what if it's always going to show up? Right till your last breath. That's not the point. The point is that it can be there and you can experience this other experience also at the same time. There's our humanity, there's our divinity. And that's the great mystery, it's the great paradox. And we just always are trying to fix this other part of us. So God can be experienced in great suffering and in great love. Not necessarily in our lives, all lives at all times. We don't have to endure suffering. It doesn't have to be part of the experience, but it probably will be. And we don't always experience great love. But God is available in either experience if we are open to it. So it's not about overcoming as so much it is about embracing our experience. And we give ourselves permission to go down into the depths, into the mud. And again, the story of Thomas is all about touching. It's telling us that if we want to experience God, the divine, then reach out and touch someone, as the song says. Don't think that this is some experience that you're going to have yourself on some high mountain and that this is where you're really going to find God. No, reach out and touch. And again, Richard Rohr says in the book, which I've never heard anybody say, that Thomas wasn't the only one touched by the experience. That the risen Christ was also. And I thought, boy, that's profound, that's beautiful. But we have to be willing to allow ourselves to be touched, and touch deeply, like, this is, I know, but when I heard that, whatever his name is, al-Bukhari or whatever, was assassinated and blew himself up to death, I immediately thought, how sad. I know probably there are people who are dancing on his grave and think that that's wonderful, But to allow ourselves to understand that here's the human being who has gotten a bit off the track, but to have compassion. Why do we think that we can have, no compassion regardless of what happens? Or that 39 people who died in the back of the refrigerated unit in England, to just read that and, oh, that's not a nice story, just move on to something stupid on Facebook that's more, whatever. But for us to feel things in their depths, that's what we're being invited to, because that will develop our potential. That will make us this incredible being, loving being, kind, forgiving, serving. And the gateway to heaven is everywhere. It's in every experience, in every encounter with everyone, and every story that you hear about everyone. I remember something else that Matt Kahn said once, that is that every time you've looked in someone's eyes, that in the moment of your transition, that person will be present to you again. That the exchange of energy, because it is the divine gazing at the divine. Anytime we do that. And it's like it all rushes back in. How powerful when you think about that. That everything we see is an opportunity, a moment for us to bless and to celebrate and to see the divine in others and to experience it in ourselves. So maybe the mantra that we can have this week is, I will embrace my whole self, not just my soul, not just the parts that I like, but all of me.